Hello, I'm Bob Morgan with the VeneerFactoryOutlet.com, and today we're going to give you a quick lesson on how to apply a stain and how to apply a finish to a wood veneer. Bear in mind that a wood veneer is a real wood, so whatever you could do to a real wood surface is exactly the same what you could do to a wood veneer. I'm going to start out staining a piece of oak here for you, and generally stains can be put on with a rag or a brush, or just about any way you can get them on there is fine. You want to start out your surface of the wood that you're going to stain is you want it to be sanded nice and smooth ahead of time. You don't want to have a rough surface, because that'll just give you problems later. So you want to sand it generally. You can start, if you have a rough surface, fairly rough, or surface that needs sanding, start maybe 100 grit. That might be a good place to start. Then you might proceed up to a 150 grit, which is finer grit, gives you a finer sand. Maybe even go all the way to a 220 grit. In my case today, all of the veneers that we sell at the VeneerFactoryOutlet.com are sanded ahead of time for you, and they're sanded at the factory. As a matter of fact, they're sanded nice and smooth, and so smooth that sometimes you might even need to rough them up just a little bit with a grit that's not so fine. In fact, if you sand a wooden surface with too fine of a grit, it actually doesn't take the stain very well. So this wooden surface here is really nicely sanded. It's very, very smooth, pre-sanded at the factory. I suspect it probably will take a stain fairly well, but maybe it won't soak in real deep. So you just you use a cheap brush for this. There's nothing real serious about how you do this. You could use a rag. You notice that I'm using some gloves here too. Generally speaking, probably best always to go with the grain if you can. It just helps to get it to go into the wood a little bit. Start out with if you want a dark stain on your wood, I would recommend that you start out with a stain that's a little bit lighter than what you might think you need, because generally what happens is that the stains actually produce a little darker color than what you think. That's just a general rule of thumb. Now you take this item and you put it to the side for maybe 2 minutes, okay? Let that stain soak in there. And then at the end of your 2-minute period, this one here has been pre-stained ahead of time, so at the end of your 2-minute period, you take a rag and you wipe that right off of there. Get all that stain wiped right off. The longer you let it sit, the deeper it will penetrate and the darker it'll make the wood. So this is a nice light stain here for this oak. Now, if you don't like the color that you end up with, let's say that you decided that this is not quite dark enough for you. So then you can go back and you can restain. You could restain it as many times as you want, and the longer you let it sit, the darker the color will be after you wipe it off. So that's how you start out staining something. I prefer most of the work that I do. I prefer just the raw wood itself. I just like the way that the wood tones come out under a natural finish. So today we're going to proceed along. If you had your item that was stained and you wanted to finish it, you would finish it just like I'm going to show you here now. You would have to wait maybe at least 4 or 5 hours for that stain to kind of dry. Sometimes maybe more than that, maybe up to 24 hours. Okay, so once again, if you're starting with a surface that needs sanding, you would have to sand, like I mentioned a minute ago. In the case of the wood veneers, they're pre-sanded at the factory. So what I have here is a wooden veneer item that has already received the first coat. the first coat of varnish. So actually, what you need to know is that it goes on just with a regular brush or even a rag. A cheap brush is fine, and you let it cure for maybe 24 hours in the case of a varnish. If it's a water-based varnish, it can cure faster. The solvent-based varnishes take up maybe like 24 hours to cure up. Now, if you're going to use a brush with a solvent-based varnish, such as what we're going to do today, you want to make sure your bristles are a natural bristle brush. And if you use water-based varnishes, polyurethane varnish, you can use like a synthetic brush with polyester nylon bristles. One thing to remember, don't shake the can. Stir it instead of shaking it. And you want to apply thin coats, not real heavy-duty coats. The first coat is the easy coat. The coats thereafter get more important. So this first coat has dried, and I'm going to sand this here with, it's pretty smooth, but I think I'll sand it with, start out maybe with a 100 grit here, just to smooth it out a little more, knock off any high spots or any grain that raised up a little bit. So you do that, and then make sure you want to wipe off that surface, get rid of any residues. You could proceed along, and you could go all the way up to a 220 grit. It just depends on how it feels to you. In this case, it's pretty smooth. Some people use a tack rag, and a tack rag picks up items off the surface. I don't recommend tack rags because they can introduce chemicals onto the surface that'll cause you a problem. Now, we talked about your first coat being the easy coat. From there on after, I really recommend that you use a good brush, and if you have a serious project you're working on, get a new brush. You'd be surprised what a difference it can make having a real nice good brush to work with. So don't skimp on your brush. This is a brand new brush here. Once again, it's a natural bristle brush, and we're going to brush with the grain. Generally speaking, that's the best to do. And you don't want to put thick coats. You want to put thin coats. Make sure you get coverage. Look at it in the light. This is your second coat now. First coat was done a while ago. First coat is the easy coat. You can do everything wrong on the first coat. So, just give it a nice good touch with your brush with the grain and thin coats. Now you set this aside for 24 hours or so, and after 24 hours you're ready for the third coat. Now the third coat could actually be the final coat. In my case, I think I'm going to put 4 coats on today. So what I'm going to do is, it still feels pretty good, but I got a little bit of roughness over in here that I might want to sand out. So I'm going to start out with my 100 grit here. The grit number determines how coarse the sandpaper is. Like 100 grit is coarser than a 150. And a 150 is coarser than a 220. So the grit numbers tell you how coarse your sandpaper is. Now naturally you wouldn't want to start with such a coarse grit that it would actually put marks into the wood surface itself and mar it up. So 100 grit is coarse enough. So you can do it by hand. This is a small item here. In this case, I think hand sanding is just fine. But if I had a large surface area, I'd have a palm sander that I would be using. And once again, I'm going with the grain here. That's usually what you need to do, is go with the grain. And you wipe it off, get all the stuff off of there. Don't want anything left over. Leftover particles can cause problems with your finish later. So you just kind of feel it and see how it feels. If it feels nice and smooth, you're probably in good shape. Now if you really want a finer, you want to go finer yet? Well, you can. You can go to a 150. Some people recommend that you go maybe to a 220 in between coats. So I'm gonna take this all the way to a 220 today. Be nice and smooth. So we go from the 150 now, we're gonna go to a 220 here. Finish this off real quick. The more coats you put on, the more important it becomes from each coat to the next to do a good sanding job. I mean, it's always important, but those final coats, you want to make sure that you don't have any unevenness. Everything is smooth. That's when it starts getting important. So, we're ready for our next coat now. And once again, you're going to use a brush that's a good quality brush. Make sure you get everything off there that could be on. And you're going to go with the grain and not too heavy of a coat. Now, some people will use steel wool even. If you use steel wool, you have to use the grain of the steel wool perpendicular to the grain of the wood itself, and then sand with that wool. You go with the grain. That's usually for pretty fine surfaces that you want to do. Sometimes it's even after you get done with the finishing process. Bear in mind, if you use a steel wool though, that if you're going to have a water-based finish, this today is not water-based, but if there's any leftover steel wool particles on the surface with a water-based finish, that'll rust and cause you a problem. So now that coat is complete, and you put it to the side. We're acting today like it's all one piece of wood. These are several pieces of wood, of course, just to illustrate the point. After 24 hours, you're ready for your final coat. And I think I'm going to be real sure that I sand this, get this just the way I want it here. This is going to be my most important coat here because it's the final coat. Starting out with 100 grit. You want to be sure that I'll move up to a 150 now. You want to be sure that your surface, that the finish has cured. Whenever you sand, you don't want to sand on a finish that's not totally cured up. It just causes you problems. So if you're in doubt, always let it go a little longer. Let it dry a little longer than you might think. We'll finish this off with a 220. And then you're going to wipe it, get all the residue off of there. Now, you can use a brush, and particularly if you do on this final coat, you're going to you want to make sure you use a good brush like we talked about. But I think today I'm going to switch to a spray, and I've been telling you we've been using varnish, but we're really using shellac today because it dries so fast. But the process is pretty much identical from a varnish to a shellac, so it doesn't really matter for our purposes. And the reason I'm going to spray this is because I think the final coat usually comes out better when you spray it, and you don't have any problem with any brush marks. So I'm going to spray this surface here. Stand back, don't get right up close. And you really don't want to put too heavy. Too heavy causes problems. That's probably about enough right there. So that's it for today. I'm Bob Morgan, and I hope you learned something today. I'm Bob Morgan with the VeneerFactoryOutlet.com.